Hello and welcome to SCDM Live. And today we're looking back at the highs and lows of 2020. And we have all had to learn to live with the reality of a global pandemic that has changed our lives. Well, whilst 2020 will forever be a year defined by COVID-19, plenty of other things have happened during the year. And for the clinical data management industry, it was a truly transformative time. And in this webinar, we're going to be revealing the biggest game changers of 2020 and what it's meant for the CDM industry. So we have with us Michael Gude, VP Global Data Operations at PRA Health, and of course the chair of SCDM for 2020. Good to see you, Michael.
Good morning, Kathy.
We have Catherine Seligon, Executive Director of Data Monitoring and Management at Pfizer. Hello, Catherine.
Hello,
and
Kathy.
Ian Schaefer. Hello there. Ian Schaefer, Partner, Pharmaceutical and Life Sciences R&D Strategy at PwC. And Jonathan Andrus is Chief Business Officer at Clinical Inc., experts in using innovative technologies in clinical trials. So we will be talking about clinical trials a little bit later on. So welcome to you all. Great to have you here. And thank you all as well to everybody at home or at work who are joining us for this webinar. And we do have a truly global audience. So we will have from the Americas, from Europe and from Asia. So wherever you are very welcome. And we do want you to be engaged. We want you to be involved in today's discussion. So please send us questions. Use the question pane in the sidebar to ask your question. And we promise we will try to get to as many of them as we can today. Try to keep the questions short if you can, because then it's easier for me to be able to read them and pass them on to our speakers. So we look forward to hearing from you, but at any stage, send a question and we will be looking at it. So let's dive straight in. And I'm going to start with you, Michael, because you have been with us in 2020 for SCDM President, and we know it's been a challenging year. We know it's been a challenging year for SCDM. We know it's a challenging year for the whole industry. There has actually been a lot of resilience out there, though, hasn't there? There's been a lot of people prepared to change things very, very quickly. Give us a sense of the game changers, the way that you have seen the past year.
Thank you for the question, Kathy. And first of all, again, good morning again to you. And I have to say, it's good to see you again. You're bringing back very fond memories from our annual conference, where you, of course, played a pivotal role there. And so good to see you again. In regards to your question, you're absolutely right. Challenging year might be an understatement for 2020, but there were good things that happened or came out of the need of having to change very, very quickly. And if I compare to changes that have happened historically in our industry for clinical data management, one thing that sticks out to me that this time, the speed of the change and how we in our industry, and especially in clinical data management and clinical data science, had to evolve and reinvent ourselves quickly is definitely unprecedented. I could draw a parallel to what happened historically when in the early 2000s we made the shift from paper to EDC, which I would say us as an industry took us about a decade to fully adopt it. I do remember endless SCDM conferences, webinars talking about the cost implication and the move. And again, it took us 10 years. We've been speaking for quite a while from the move from data management to data science to patient centricity, how to get closer to the source. All of that was accelerated and condensed in 2020 in 1 year. We found ourselves in an environment where patients were not able to go to clinical sites anymore. We found ourselves in an environment where CRAs, clinical research associates, couldn't go to the sites to perform source data verification. So all of that was going on, and we had to find tools and adjust our processes, work with regulators to see how can we accelerate those clinical studies and adjust to our new reality. So it was definitely a catalyst for our industry.
And what about the SCDM itself as an organization? What sort of role do you think it's played? Because obviously you've been chairing for the year. Do you think it really did help to bring the community together? Because obviously, you know, with this pace of change, there was needed to be an exchange and a central point through which to make those exchanges.
Definitely, and I would like to go back then to the pillars of SCDM, which is thought leadership, education, and advocacy. It's part of our vision and mission statements, and we put those things out. I want to think that they were never more true in 2020, where we had to provide a helping hand in terms of all of those three pillars to our membership. Areas that come to mind, first of all, our white papers, which is, if you look at the series of 3 white papers that came out talking about the transition from clinical data management to clinical data science, the first of those papers came out at the end of 2019, the second beginning of 2020, right when COVID started, and the third one then in the summer of 2020. But the first 2 ones, they were almost predicting the future, what was going to happen, and that future happened so much quicker. So those 3 white papers are definitely key reference points on how we see our industry moving and giving some great guidance. Let's not forget our annual conferences and all the virtual events. I mean, the annual conference in September, definitely the main event, but we had many regional events. So from an SCDM perspective, we adjusted rather quickly to the new reality, going virtual, learning from other venues to see how it would be if we were to go in a hybrid venue. Luckily, we went for fully virtual. And we had a record number of attendees, which showed that there was an appetite, there was a need, people were looking for guidance, and we were able to provide it with SCDM. And lastly, let's not forget also the series of regulatory panels we had where SCDM is driving the dialogue with our colleagues in the regulatory agencies globally to make sure that whatever we put out there from an SCDM perspective is sound and supported by regulatory as well.
I like the fact that the authors of your papers are fortune tellers, seeing into the future. And yep. I know that when we spoke in September, you were talking very passionately about this shift from clinical data management to clinical data science. I mean, you've just referred to it. But has the shift really started? I mean, do you think we're well on the way now?
It definitely has, and it's interesting that you point out the passion. It would be hard for me to turn that off, and I think if anything happened last year, even increased it more. I can tell what is interesting is the whole world is looking now at the pharma industry and biotech industry for cures and vaccines. Obviously, suddenly everybody in the regular population knows what a phase 3 study is. Everybody has an opinion on how quickly clinical studies should be conducted. So you see a lot of interest there, which of course only makes the fact that we work in this industry more interesting, and it increases our accountability and responsibility to deliver, of course, high quality data to make sure whatever gets being put out there in terms of vaccines or any other medicines that of course continue to be developed as well are sound. So that's not going to go away. In terms of the changes, I can point to changes happening in my own organization right now, where everything that happened in 2020 definitely accelerated the change or the transition and evolution from clinical data management into data science. Within my own group, we are changing titles right now. We are making the fact that we have to collect data much closer to the patient. The whole world of eCOA, ePro, decentralized clinical studies is being implemented within my group as we speak. So it was, again, definitely a catalyst. I see the change is real, and I do believe that it's here to stay.
I mean, it's so true that everybody knows so much about clinical trials, or so they think they do anyway at the moment. Maybe I can bring in some of the other speakers on this one, this shift from clinical data management to clinical data science, just to get your thoughts on it, because it's more than just rebranding, isn't it? I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on it, Ian. Your microphone's not on. Your microphone's muted.
I knew I was going to do that.
But that is the phrase of the year, isn't it? Everybody, that your microphone is muted, it will go down as
yes. You're speaking on mute. Yes, that's pretty much it. Sums up 2020 nicely. But I think Mikhail outlined a few really interesting key points there, right? The kind of the self-imposed boundaries that we always put out in terms of adoption of these capabilities, where we put up more barriers than really exist in terms of moving from today in terms of the future and getting value out of those things. I think the cultural shift as well in terms of the reactive to the proactive aspect, and really starting to think about, how do we assess risk across the entire life cycle of the clinical development process, as well within a clinical trial. And I think the other area that has been really fascinating to see is as you said, Mikhail, just the speed in which we were able to pivot. If you had said, 5 years ago that we would go from concept around decentralized or even virtual trials, engaging in patients in completely fundamentally different ways, using new digital capabilities in a matter of months, as well as in flight with some clinical trials that were actually critical to the portfolio. I probably would have been extremely skeptical. But now seeing backwards and seeing what we've actually accomplished, it gives me a lot of confidence and faith that there's a lot more that we can do.
Yeah, well, that word speed, I'm sure, will stay with us throughout. So let's move on. I mean, we've been hearing this big theme: shift to clinical data science. Obviously, we will talk about risk-based quality management, AI, machine learning, decentralized clinical trials we've referred to, regulatory matters. So maybe I can bring Catherine in now, Executive Director of Data Monitoring and Management at Pfizer. Let's talk then, Catherine, about this progressive shift from data management to data science. And I mean, what tools can you use to make that shift easier?
Yes, good morning again. Thank you for that question, Kathy. So in my mind, it really starts with what we are trying to achieve with our focus. And over the past few years, we have clearly reoriented that focus. We are shifting our mindset from, in terms of data quality, from every single data point matters. Every single data point is equal to quality as the absence of errors that matter. And I'm taking this quote from a gentleman from the FDA whose name escapes me at the moment, but I want to still give him credit. So this is a shift that definitely has been explicitly encouraged, even propelled by the regulators. So we are seeing our organizations adopting risk-based quality management principles, incorporating quality by design approaches from the get-go, from the start, from the point in time when the protocol is being designed, implementing quality controls also, and adopting continuous improvement strategies. So as a result, if we want to be consistent with that approach, our tools need to reflect that evolution. And I'm thinking of two types of tools in particular that facilitate this evolution, which, as Michael and Ian were saying, has been significantly accelerated in the past few months with the COVID-19 pandemic. So one type of tool in my mind is are tools that help us implement risk-based approaches by allowing us to document in a very systematic way what is critical data for your study, defined as what data do you need to execute on your analysis. And then also propagate, if I can put it this way, this designation to downstream processes for reuse, so that you do it only once, right? It's a significant process that requires focus from the entire study team. So any tools that allow you to embed critical designation in our data standard to facilitate reuse. And it could be something as mundane as a really nice a DRP, data review plan template, or something significantly more sophisticated, such as a metadata repository. And then obviously what everyone thinks about when you think about implementing risk-based approaches are all these tools that make it easy for the CDS and quite frankly for the entire team, CDSs, clinicians, etc., anyone who reviews data to focus, zero in on your critical data. So these are your tools that can be easily customized to meet the efficacy needs of a study, but also that have library capabilities to have standard reports that can be reused. Again, don't reinvent the wheel, save time. Visualization tools, of course, that allow you to spot trends in your data, look at outliers, investigate them. And then, of course, risk-based monitoring tools, which can be used not only for risk-based monitoring, as the name indicates, but also to truly do process control. Look at your processes and identify what might be not going as you planned. And finally, last but not least, I think that the last few months have seen an increased adoption of artificial intelligence, allowing us to spot discrepancies amongst data types in a more routine manner. For instance, doing your adverse event versus concomitant medication, adverse event versus dosing, etc. Things that, as I said, are quite routine and allow, if you outsource that to delegate that to artificial intelligence, then the CDSs and the clinicians have more time to dedicate to more involved tasks. So that's kind of what I'm thinking in terms of the critical tool. I apologize.
No. I mean, so you mentioned AI. We obviously will talk about that. And interestingly, you say at certain things, don't reinvent the wheel. That's also very interesting. Let's talk some more about the shift to risk-based quality management. We're talking about data-driven, risk-based monitoring in clinical trials. And this is really a fundamental shift in design and management. And the theory is that there'll be no surprises at the end of the trial, I suppose. But tell us how COVID has affected the whole implementation and the planning of this.
Yes, absolutely, Kathy. And this is really something that deserves to be highlighted. So the pharmaceutical industry traditionally is a very conservative industry. I think it's fair to say, but really in order for us to beat the pandemic, we have been forced to innovate, to implement strategy that, quite frankly, in the past had only been tentatively discussed. And even so, when they were discussed, those discussions were quite difficult, sometimes a bit antagonistic as well. However, in the COVID-19 pandemic, along with all the sadness and really the genuine stress that it has brought to us, it has also become a remarkable catalyst and accelerator for the changes, for the adoption of the new processes and technologies, and most importantly, the mindset that I was just talking about. So initially, of course, we were in full-blown reactive mode, trying to cope with study closures, with slumping enrollment, concerns over the safety of our patients, very importantly, missed visits, loss of data, regulatory guidance, you name it. So on the fly, we implemented palliative measures to safeguard the safety of our patients and preserve the integrity of our data. So remote monitoring, expanded RBM. It's amazing the number of study teams that were pushing back on RBM and then started lining up to adopt it and expand it quite fast. Decentralized trial, dashboards, capturing reasons for missed visits and evaluation at the request of the FDA, and this request was, of course, very appropriate. But now that, so we've done all that, and now we realize that it worked. We got submissions in that were approved based on these data, precisely because we were successful in preserving the data integrity, the reliability of the data, despite everything we had to contend with. So those strategies are now taken for granted. They are becoming mainstream. They are part of our normal toolbox. So our SOPs are being updated to incorporate them, and our management are really expecting us to continue to do that. And I think that, as a discipline, data management, we want to continue doing that because it's quite exciting what we've been able to achieve. So in terms of the impact of COVID-19, I'm thinking a few things. And I think that Michael and Ian already touched on that. Heightened expectations in terms of what can be achieved, cycle times, quality, the importance of technology also that allows us to zero in on those critical data points, the importance of CDS as a project manager, and that's really key. We come in being able to look at the data in great detail using sophisticated dashboards to help study teams focus on milestones and focus on critical data, in relation to those milestones and pinpointing and diagnosing issues and marshalling resources to achieve our goals. And finally, also the CDS, very importantly, as a communicator, as an educator, we've made so many changes across the board, across the organization. We find ourselves in a position to have to help teams understand the why and the how, and quite frankly, guide them through that to make sure that everything is on the same page, everyone is on the same page. So I think this is here to stay, and there's no going back.
So what about that human element? I mean, you sort of talk about the need to guide people, and we heard in the annual conference there was this whole session about the importance of good project management in the shift to clinical data science. So how do you keep that human element in there, the people element, front and center when we're talking about clinical data science?
Yes, Kathy. So that's a really good point and a good observation. The great news, I think, I'm very optimistic about the clinical data scientist role. I think it has only become more central, more visible in the last few years and last few months. And why is that? I think it comes down to what we are able to bring to the table, the value that we add. So we're able to drive the conversations on which data is critical. We're subject matter experts on data, right? So we're in the best position to do that in collaboration with our clinicians and statisticians. We're able to navigate also on a different point, but we're able to navigate and draw actionable insights from dashboards, metrics, again, guide the teams, show them we're missing data here. This is potentially significant for our analysis. What can we do? Can we recover from this? What can we implement? And of course, the CDSs, with the support of our informatics organization, are able to help roll out new technologies, such as visualization, such as exception report, artificial intelligence, and again, be the facilitator of the adoption of these technologies, help the teams understand, show them, like really hands-on, show them what they can do with this. So I will agree that this is a lot, but the possibilities really are so exciting. So my advice to clinical data scientists would be twofold. First of all, be confident in the skills that you already have. You're already excellent project managers. You are subject matter experts in data. That's really key. That doesn't change, that doesn't go away, and it will not become irrelevant. It's always relevant. And then additionally, what you need to add on top of that is really to commit to educating yourselves about all these challenges. One at a time, think about technologies, think about new study design, those adaptive trials, umbrella studies, etc. As well, very importantly, in my mind, as the trends in the therapeutic areas that you support, this will enable you to have more meaningful dialogues with your clinicians in particular and your statistician. So I think that in order to be pragmatic, you have to prioritize by impact, which very often means focusing on critical data and how the critical data relates to your milestones. Cultivate your communication and influencing skills. And this is because the more knowledgeable you are, the more value you add to the organization, the more influential you will be. That's very simple.
Well, you say it's simple, but I think some organizations might be struggling. Maybe I'd bring in one of the other speakers to talk a bit more about that. I mean, this cultural shift, this need for upskilling, it is quite complex. Mikhail, do you have any thoughts on that? That just, what more needs to be done and how people can be supported in the road along the way?
Well, Catherine hit on a lot of points, and I liked her quote in regards to be confident in your own skills. So just building on that. And while Catherine was explaining that, I was just thinking about nothing of what is expected today. I will have admit I learned in college or was part of my degree, or even 10, 15 years ago, if somebody had approached me with a decentralized clinical trial, the tools might not have been there, the understanding was not there, the regulatory framework was not there. So it's one of those areas where it shows that within our industry, we have to keep on being agile. Ian said that he was surprised or encouraged by the quick way we were able to pivot to the new normal. And this gives me a ton of hope that whatever the environment, the industry might throw at us, or the expectations might be, that we can do that. I heard the word speed quite a lot in terms of how quickly things went. And if you think about how long it usually or traditionally takes or took to bring new drugs to market, and how quickly we were able to get, when we talk about COVID, things to the market right now, it speaks for us that we have a huge potential here, that we should use this opportunity and tap in. Lastly, from my end, because I'm sure that my colleagues here have something to add it as well, it's always the human element, and I want to go back to some of the fundamentals when I think about data. One thing that did not change is, it's only becoming more important, is the realization that data will always be there and has to be there to determine what's working, what's not working, and to drive our decision. It seems very basic what I'm saying here, but I sometimes see in discussions that that point is forgotten, where the focus is on other areas of our industry. But I usually like to point out, as Catherine said, to lead the discussion, to remind people, is that we have actual human beings, patients or subjects in clinical studies, who are the key source of the data we want to get to. So let's try to be as direct as possible to that real source of data, engage patients, not just a few percentage that have the ability to go to a clinical study. There are so many more, the vast majority of patients that could benefit from clinical studies, and we are not reaching out to them. So we can accelerate by doing that. But that's not the fundamentals to how do we bring the true source of data that is originate at the patient directly into organizations, analyze it, validate it as quickly, and derive our decisions, and which then would lead to new drugs to market. This is a hugely fascinating area. And so, yeah, looking forward to what the next month and years have to bring on that topic.
Thank you very much indeed. Just before we go into our next section, we're going to talk about technology. If you've got any questions, please do send them, and we will weave them into our conversation, or we'll put them into our Q&A session at the end. So please send questions now. So let us talk about technology. I'm going to bring in Ian Schaefer now, because I think you're our man from PwC to talk technology. It's obviously much more sophisticated. We've got data coming from intensive global studies. You need sophisticated technologies, that's for sure. We've talked about artificial intelligence very briefly, machine learning for clinical trials. So I know you're a partner in PwC's pharmaceutical advisory practice. So give us a sense then, Ian, of the best practices. How do we take full advantage of technology? Because, you know, things like, I don't know, catching critical errors early on before it's too late to make sure that a drug really is safe and effective, you know, that sort of thing.
Well, I think the first reaction is, like everything, technology is the how. That's how you achieve it. Best practices really come by focusing on the what. And Catherine really, I think, hit on one of the key points that I would raise, is that as we kind of move away from the traditional RBM concept into the RBX concept, where we're looking at risk across everything, the quality by design concept is key in terms of achieving these things. So when you're looking at how you structure your overall QMS and really starting to adopt quality by design, starting with the critical to quality factors, the things that really, really matter, and truly understanding them, your primary, secondary objectives, your safety objectives, your patient eligibility, your investigator product exposure, you know, really trying to understand those, not at a organizational level, obviously more systematic within therapeutic areas and individual trials. But then obviously moving next into that, and Catherine hit on some of these as well, is based upon those key areas, those qualitative factors, truly understanding what the quality data that you need in the quality process, the critical to quality data and critical to quality process, truly understanding that gives you a focus point in terms of how and where you can start to apply those technologies. And then of course, as you mentioned before, risk management is everything. Looking at the risk controls, your KRIs, your QTLs, and as Mikhail pointed out, that's data. everything in today's world is now data. So starting with that concept, quality by design, and decomposing it systematically across your organization and truly adopting those key points, that will then influence and give you direction in terms of how best to use technology.
Well, Mikhail was talking about AI and machine learning being amongst the game changers of 2020. Obviously really good at finding patterns and this sort of thing, but I mean, where are the main challenges though before the use of AI becomes just commonplace when we're talking about designing studies or analyzing data? I mean, what are the challenges to overcome before it just becomes our everyday go-to?
Yep, I think it's across many different factors, of course, right? So the first challenge is, as Mikhail pointed out, it's all about the data. If you don't have access to data, if you don't have high quality data, and if you don't have volumes of data, you're not actually able to create some of these more sophisticated capabilities. That's why one of the first areas where the industry has really started to grab hold of machine learning and AI capabilities in pharmacovigilance. That's very high quality data, tons of it, and you're actually able to then not only develop your models, but then train them. So the first focus I always say is focus on your data. Second is, I would say, focusing on value. People tend to jump right into the solution and looking at the technology and how can you solve that. I've seen more programs and projects fail because they weren't focused on the value first. So when you're thinking about what can it do, is it something that solves a quality problem? Is it a resourcing problem? Is it efficiency, productivity? Really truly understanding where the value comes from and aligning your stakeholders in terms of what's the importance of this, why do we need to do this, and how can we actually achieve some of these benefits in a very practical and tangible way. The second area is really around the adoption, or the third area I should say, is really around the adoption of the technology itself. When you're actually going through the development of these more sophisticated machine learning models, or even using cognitive AI and recommendation engines, the first thing that actually comes to mind is around the training of these models. This is something that's fundamentally different that we've never really tackled, with using technology before. And again, it goes back to data. Do you have the data to actually train the models on? What does good look like? The fifth area is really around validation. Most of our computerized validation systems that we have, or processes that we have in place today, are not equipped to actually tackle these more complex technologies. And there really needs to be a significant overhaul in terms of how you actually approach validation when you're looking at things like machine learning and AI. And then the last is not around the actual deployment of the technology, but the use of it. It requires a fundamentally different governance model at the end of the day. And again, this comes back to, is the actual capability performing as expected? Are you seeing the outcomes that you're actually trying to achieve, not only from a value perspective, but is the system operating as intended? There's often many situations where actually models start to actually learn from the data. They start to behave in different ways than intended. You may actually have to go back and retrain the model. So having that tight governance in terms of the use and the application of it, that's a key area. And the last is really around the people. I think it's important to unpack like what AI actually is. In the beginning, when we started down this journey, more often than not, people would start to roll their eyes because they said, "Oh, AI, that's fantastical. We'll never get there." But really understanding there's many different technologies kind of bundled in there. There's RPA, which is robotic process automation. We've actually been using that for years. And to Mikhail's point, we've actually been using it in edit checks probably for 30 years at this point. That's a form of RPA at its most simple. But actually now the more sophisticated RPA capabilities allow us to actually act like humans using very simple if-then logic to actually move across systems and perform tasks that humans can do. Now we're moving into things that are more complex, like machine learning, as we've talked about. That's really pattern detection at the end of the day, using large volumes of data, disparate data sources, being able to detect patterns that humans probably would have never actually stumbled upon just doing traditional reviews with line listings. And then there's AI. Now this is where you're actually getting into what I would say is supervised and unsupervised AI. Unsupervised AI, we're not there yet. That's going to be some time. The FDA has been very clear. They're not comfortable with black box AI at this point. It always has to be what I would call supervised AI at this point. We're now combining machine learning, which is pattern detection, and adding a recommendation engine on top of it. And that is really where now you're getting to some of the more sophisticated capabilities where humans are now actually just reading the data or reading the reaction from the AI bot and saying, this is what actually we recommend. Do you agree? Yes or no?
I mean, the potential is just gigantic, isn't it? And yet we heard Catherine saying before that, you know, this is a conservative industry. But when you talk like that, you can't have conservatism if you're going to embrace AI and ML.
No, you can't. You do have to, I would say, take a leap of faith and start small, move fast. Don't be worried about breaking things and breaking some of the traditional parodies and norms. And again, if you focus on value and you leverage proof of concept approaches and things like that, you can actually convert the naysayers relatively quickly. There's been several projects where we've come in and actually done proof of concepts to say, you have this problem, let us show you how you could do it in a fundamentally different way using these technologies. And we've converted people at the end of it because we focused on value, moved quickly, and didn't bite off more than chew.
Okay, focus on value. So I know that at the conference in September, we were talking about moving away, using AI and ML to move away from the classical role of basically cleaning data towards quality by design. So that's something that's sort of really important, I guess, going forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. And these are tools that can be used in place. And if you think about some of the challenges that we have today, right? We're moving away from single, multi-arm, double randomized trials into much more concepts, like Catherine said, around more adaptive trials using master protocols. Now we have to think in not just 1 or 2 dimensions, but 3 and 4 dimensions simultaneously. The number and volume of data that's actually being used within a control is exploding. The volumes of the data in particular, as soon as we start bringing in things like wearables, we're actually not just measuring, say, a visit over a period of several weeks. We're actually now getting real-time data at every other minute or even on a second basis. The volumes of data just become impractical for humans to actually manage, and we need these types of capabilities to actually get value out of them.
Now that really is mind-blowing, the quantity of data that's coming in from various sources. Maybe I could just bring in some of the other speakers to get your views on AI and see where you see where already AI is being used the most, or where you see the greatest potential. I mean, I don't know if you've got thoughts on this, Catherine. Can you hear me, Catherine?
Yes. Yes, I can. So yes, absolutely. I mean, as an example, at Pfizer, and I started touching on this earlier, we have harnessed the power of AI, machine learning, to take the more obvious data discrepancy management out of the plate of the clinical data scientist. So as Ian was saying, using huge data sets worth of historical data, historical queries, and training the algorithm to recognize patterns, so giving them data and giving them old queries that had already been issued, and allowing them to recognize where the discrepancies were, and also training them on what is a good query from a wording standpoint, from a positioning standpoint. And so we had, quite frankly, small armies of data managers training those systems on these very large data sets. And now we're able to apply the algorithms to new studies. In fact, it was applied on our most recent COVID vaccine study very effectively. It's working amazingly well. I mean, we're seeing decreases, again, going back to the concept of value that Ian brought up as being so central, so critical. We're seeing incredible savings in terms of cycle time from the point of view the data is entered to, from the point of time when the data is entered to the time the query is entered, decreases at upward of 80%. And also, you have now the data managers who are able to focus their energy, their brain power on the more intricate aspects of the data, and also use that to communicate more, to think about what matters, to think about quality control. So they have more time to dedicate to the steps that really matter, that are really part of the whole risk-based quality management cycle.
So it's always good that it comes back to the human element, that you're freeing up humans in a way to think in different ways. Yeah, it's good.
Exactly it.
What about any of our other speakers? Do we have any thoughts on this? I need to see you all to see whether anyone wants to join in on the conversation. Yeah, Jonathan.
I'll do the old-fashioned way of raising my hand.
I love it. No, well, it's much
no,
easier. It's much easier.
The only thing I was going to say is that SCDM, as a society, we're also looking to put together some upcoming trainings and webinars on these topics to continue the dialogue, involving our regulators and others. I mean, to Ian's point, right, he talked about unsupervised versus supervised and some concerns around that. Again, as a society, right, we owe it to our members at large, as well as our clinical data scientists at large, whether members or not, right, to continue to provide information and training and relevant content as this unfolds and gets used more and more. We need to make sure that we're providing, training and materials, especially as we pivot with our good clinical data management practices and our certified clinical data manager exam. We're looking at all of these things and how we make sure that we stay current and fresh with all those things that are going on. So I just wanted to add that plug.
No,
to,
well, I'm going to come and talk to you in a minute, but obviously, but I mean, are you with Ian on this necessity to focus on value? Is that really, do people get the whole AI thing better if they know that that's where the focus has to be?
Well, I think doing it just because you can. Well, I was just going to say, doing it just because you can do it doesn't necessarily mean you should, right? It's looking at that return on investment and the value that it brings to the table. I think Catherine touched upon the fact, right? It's enabling the ability to take mundane, routine tasks away from clinical data scientists and allowing them to focus on the things that really matter. So I don't know if Catherine wants to add anything to that and some of the things that her team there at Pfizer has been able to do as a result of using, artificial intelligence and other tools as a part of some of the studies that they've been working on. But, that certainly is the value that it brings for sure.
Well, perhaps we'll go back to that in a moment, but let me just stay with you while I've got you, Jonathan, before you go off anywhere. Okay. I know you're chief business officer.
I promise.
You're not going anywhere. None of us is going anywhere at the moment.
I'm tethered to my desk by a wire,
right? Chief business officer at Clinical Inc. So you're very involved in clinical trials. I mean, we've already referred to this, but I mean, COVID-19 has really, to begin with, just was such a disaster for clinical research, wasn't it? In the sense of delaying trials or halting trials. And then people sort of caught up with it a little bit, rather a lot, and everything started to speed up. And then we moved into this whole world of decentralized trials, which is just really interesting, the way that this seems to have taken off, with the patient again, moving very much to the center. So the question is, are decentralized trials here to stay?
Well, before I answer that, because to me the obvious answer is yes, but I think when you say COVID-19 is a disaster, I would say I think it set the focus back to where it needed to be in the first place, right? And you just said it, the patient, right? Patient-centric clinical trials, right? Bringing the studies to them. And I think, as I reflect, at least in my experience and over my career, is, many companies have been looking to do decentralized trials, at-home-based trials, things like that. That's been going on for a while. I think COVID-19 brought it to the forefront of saying there are alternatives and ways that you can do this in order to speed up the clinical trial, involve more patients. And so I think, providing access, to treatment-naive patients in a decentralized way, solutions and tools and approaches like this are absolutely here to stay, because I think, again, even beyond COVID and vaccines for that, which are all wonderful and great, but there are so many other disease states and areas that could benefit from this approach, from oncologic studies to central nervous system, Alzheimer's research, all of these things where you have immunocompromised patients and patients that are not upwardly mobile, right? Being able to do things in a way that allow their caregivers and others to be involved in that process. So I think, they're absolutely here to stay. I think we're also seeing response from our regulatory agency and our regulatory agency friends of producing guidance and working together collectively across the ocean to make sure that they're producing and providing guidance and information. And obviously that's an important aspect. I'll tie it back from an SCDM standpoint too, is we want to make sure that we're engaging with them regularly on these things to make sure that we're able to speak into, from a content and subject matter expert standpoint, these things as this whole environment takes shape. One of the other things I think there's also, I'm sorry, Kathy, were you going to ask something?
No, carry on. I am going to ask you, but I can wait.
Well, it might be the question you were going to ask, which is, there's also
I was going to ask you.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask you about regulators, because you've kind of touched upon regulators. I just wanted to ask who you've got to convince, because obviously industry will be a great fan of the whole idea of the decentralized trials on the whole. But you're the chair of the SCDM regulatory panel, so you are our man with the ear of the regulators. So I mean, how are they working and trying to kind of iron out any of the problems like transparency and efficiency and that sort of thing?
Sure. Let me come to that in a minute. Well, the one thing I wanted to finish the decentralized trials and where I think it's going is the other thing that's happening is that there's an industry group that's forming up called the Decentralized Trials Research Alliance, or DTRA, and it's an ever-growing group of companies, and not just vendors, right? It's sponsor companies, it's CROs, it's vendor and technology companies too, and they're really focused on, for decentralized trials, getting key definitions. In fact, this is something they just published today, that they want to focus on definitions and best practices and education and trying to remove barriers to this. So there's industry coalition kind of coming together to tackle this decentralized trial piece as well. So I just wanted to share that as well with regard to your question about are they here to stay. I think clearly the interest and involvement from the industry is quite apparent, and people are very interested in joining forces to discuss these things and make sure that we're kind of talking from the same playbook, if you will, right? That we understand and understand the vernacular of what the terms mean and how we do things. So sorry to go back to that, but I just wanted to finish.
No, but and obviously the industry is one side of it, but so then let's go down to the regulators. So
sure.
What's the general mood amongst the regulators, and what do they feel they've got to do to be absolutely sure that this is the way forward from their perspective?
I think there's in my now 25th year of working in this industry, I have never seen as much interest and as much desire on the part of regulatory agencies, not only here in the US, but globally, to solicit guidance and to solicit, not guidance, it's the wrong word, but to solicit information and expertise from those of us in industry who are actively involved in the conduct and the carrying out of clinical trials. And I think they are definitely desiring some of that information to be brought forward to them. There are, of course, a number of initiatives, and to your point, right, every year I chair the regulatory panel. One of the other things we're doing as a society is kind of forming up what may ultimately be called kind of like the SCDM Regulatory Council, where we have regular conversations and dialogue with members of the regulatory agencies and ministries of health around the world. But even in talking with Dr. Nee, who was a part of our regulatory panel this past year, just as recent as yesterday, right, she was sharing with me about how there's just a joint collective working together from an ICHE6 R3. So now we have the third revision of ICHE6 coming out, which is going to tackle topics like decentralized clinical trials, pragmatic clinical trials, and real world evidence type clinical trials. And that's joint efforts and initiatives across FDA, Japan, Europe, et cetera, all coming together to tackle and to work on those things together. And of course, I also mentioned, right, their desire and their interest in having webinars and trainings on artificial intelligence and machine learning. And again, hearkening back to our annual conference this past year, even as well as the year before that, we had a leadership forum where we had a whole discussion about AI and ML, and regulators that were there and present in the room expressed a desire to know and understand more about actual use cases, right? They want to understand definitions of what it means, and some of those definitions that Ian talked about, but also understanding how then in a practical real world scenario would that be implemented and done, so that they can understand what to look for when they're inspecting and auditing. What if an algorithm for a machine learning algorithm changes? What do they need to look for? You know, and it's our obligation, or it should be our obligation as a society, to step up and into that and provide and bring together stakeholders, folks that are even here on this call from their respective organizations, to bring that perspective and that understanding to the table, because they're asking for it, right? It's our opportunity to actually bring that forward and help, you know, drive the direction of the industry and how we effectively and efficiently run clinical trials.
As you're talking to us, I'm hearing all your emails come in and feeling that sorry for you having to deal with them all later on. But I wanted to ask you about all I mean, traditionally, it's really difficult, isn't it, to make sure that well, basically to enroll people in some clinical trials, it's very difficult. We've got issues with lack of diversity, and so these sort of issues, I imagine, are helped enormously by the decentralization. But then you've got to bring data into the whole thing, technology into the whole thing to make sure that it works. So where do you see the sort of the main real challenges, opportunities and challenges sort of tied in together, if you like, going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously through the use of decentralized clinical trials, I think really organizations can increase their outreach, increase more and more diverse patient populations, which is absolutely critical in the research that we do. I mean, it's no secret that, you know, certain populations have been excluded from research, and I think providing decentralized clinical trials helps to garner more of a diverse population for that. You know, having trials that can be done from their own home using connectivity, and ensuring that these potential patients have the appropriate technology and devices in order to be able to do that. And we in industry can provide that through provision devices and other kinds of things to make sure that they can participate. So obviously increasing our outreach in diverse populations, and also it goes back to what I said earlier about increasing to patient naive populations as well. So, or sorry, treatment naive populations, getting to patients that maybe haven't been involved in clinical trials before, because, you know, even prior to COVID, the average research participant lived upwards of 2 hours away from a research facility, right? Which is just discouraging for anyone to participate in clinical research, let alone for the concern of going into a medical facility during COVID, let's say, but also just the sheer magnitude of the distance to a typical research site. So, but I think it's important, though, that if we're going to do that, right, that the sponsor companies, that the vendors, et cetera, provide adequate and sufficient support to provide help for that, right? Having accessible help desk and technical support to be able to do that. For example, you know, even those of us on this webinar right now, you know, needed technical support to make sure that we could access things, make sure our cameras worked, all that stuff, right? You take that on a mega phase 3 clinical trial program, and then you add patients into the mix, right? Making sure that you're supporting them adequately is absolutely critical for the success of that. Because if you frustrate a patient, right, because they can't get access or they can't get their device to work or what have you, they're going to walk away. You're going to lose them to follow up, and they're not going to be able to be retained in the study. So I think that's absolutely critical from a patient perspective and sites to make sure that you're supporting them adequately.
And of course, there's kind of still a bit of a generational thing there, isn't there, in technology? You know, younger patients can deal with the technology better than the older generation. I think we've still got one generation to go before we're probably out of that. But
I hear that frequently. I think that's becoming less and less of a problem or an issue. Maybe it's the better word for it. You know, a lot of, you know, depending on the age categorization, right? One of the things, you know, again, just as an organization, right? When we look at geographically, we look at cell phone proliferation and who has access to different cell phones, et cetera. You know, we personally, we do a lot of work in the CNS space, and you know, we're finding that regardless of age. A lot of people now are connected with smartphones and other devices and are very familiar with that. So I think obviously that's going to continue to decrease the number of people who aren't familiar with it, but I certainly don't think that should be the reason not to embrace things like that, to continue in a decentralized kind of way. Obviously, there are other considerations in trying to conduct decentralized trials as well that obviously you have to keep in mind, and that includes, I already mentioned some, like geographic considerations, like where are the sites located and what are that, kind of technology proliferation in those areas. And also regulatory and data privacy concerns. And again, that's something that, again, in interfacing and engaging with the regulators and ensuring that it doesn't stymie innovation and that doesn't stymie the use of tools and technologies in order to do the things that we've all been talking about here today, right? To be able to get to patients that desperately need new and better therapies for different disease states and conditions, I think is absolutely critical.
So if you had to sort of characterize how important this was, I mean, is this really a revolution? Is this a game changer? I mean, these are all the words that journalists like to hear, but, it's, in a way, it's not rocket science, but obviously it's suddenly become possible. We've seen that it's had to be done like this way, and so now this can be the future. But will it really, we go back to the word speed, I mean, it's just going to, one assumes, speed up the long journey that drugs take to market?
No, I do. I think that, like I said, it's absolutely here to stay. I think, again, as a society, and I'll go back to that, just, being a long time board member and past chair, et cetera, I think it's absolutely critical for us as a society to, to work together, again, in collaboration with industry groups, with regulators, et cetera, to come together to help provide that guidance and provide that information in order to ensure companies understand how to navigate these things around decentralized clinical trials and some of the other things that Ian and Catherine and Miguel have been talking about here today.
Okay, well, I'll bring the others in. Just to remind you to send any questions that you have. We've got one or two coming in. Let me ask our other speakers, just let's stick to this question, first of all, about decentralized trials. Mikael wants to speak. Yes, Mikael.
Jonathan made so many good points there. There was just one thing, maybe almost like a take-home message that came to mind as Jonathan was speaking about. We talk about decentralized clinical studies, the speed, and Kathy, you like catchphrases. Usually I don't use the word paradigm shift, but I'm going to use it today. The paradigm that we have been working on over the last decades is to try to find patients out there in the world and bring them into our clinical research sites and run clinical studies. So basically bringing the patients to the clinical study. What is shifting, what shifted in 2020 and what will have to continue to shift. And in my mind, it almost boils down to that, is that we have to bring the clinical study to the patients and not just the few percentage, the minor numbers or the lower numbers, but it's all of them out there. And it is mind-boggling to me that we as an industry, when we talk about shortening timelines, saving cost for everybody, a 2-3 year study, the time is usually on the enrollment curves to finding the patients. I think in one of the recent webinars, I don't have the actual data in front of me, but I think the average is around 0.3 patient per site per month. If you have to run thousands of subject studies out there, it's going to take an enormous amount of money, time, regional involvement to get those studies executed. So if we can find, and we have the technology and the methodologies to bring those data collection instruments, if we can bring the clinical study into patients' homes, this can be accelerated significantly. And this is what we have seen with COVID, and we see in some medications as well. So Jonathan, thank you for painting this picture there. For me, it was in the back of my mind, but you definitely unlocked the key, and to me, it boils down to that part.
Thank you very much indeed. What about any of our other speakers? Would you like to come in on this whole issue about where we're going with decentralized clinical trials? What about at Pfizer, Catherine?
So yes, I mean, decentralized clinical trials at Pfizer is definitely one of the tools that we have in our toolbox. and it has enabled us to achieve greatly improved performance, either from the beginning of the study or adapting decentralized clinical trial on the fly as a remediation, if you will, for COVID-19. In terms of, so this is one of the tools that has enabled us to achieve greater speed in terms of, as Michael was saying, bringing the trials to the patients, not necessarily expecting that the patients would go to the site to participate in the trial, or not as much. And of course, there are situations where they have to get to the site. It's an infusion that cannot be given at home. But in general, there are multiple tools now in our toolbox that allow us to achieve greater speed. We talked about focusing on critical data. We talked about technologies that we can implement. The question, I think, is going to be, how do we master all these new advances? How do we select what is appropriate given the particular design of the study, given the particular patient population, and maybe constraints with that. So be able to be judicious in our use of these tools. The other thing that I would want to say, two things actually, with respect to sustaining speed, is that we need to measure it. So measure the cycle times. And it sounds kind of boring, and I have to say that personally, metrics are a necessary evil to me. I really use them, I rely on them, but there are other things that I want to focus on. But it's very important to, if you have a time frame in mind, if you have a cycle time in mind that you want to consistently achieve, it's very important to measure all the little steps that exist in between. And if you see that something, there's a peak and it looks like you're spending all your energy, all your time on a particular step or a couple of steps, take time to dive into this, excuse me, and understand what really is going on. So importance of metrics in order to be able to improve your processes. And the other thing that I was going to say is that perhaps, just perhaps, we're not going to be able to achieve the same speed on all studies. So organizations maybe are going to need to be selective in the studies that they want to focus on and really achieve at high speed. And quite frankly, this is related to the value of the new drug, to what it can bring to the patient population and medical needs. And personally, beyond metrics, that's what I want to focus on when I have conversations with my teams. Yes, metrics are a necessary evil, but really what you have to think about, what it allows us to achieve, is bringing the drugs to the patients faster.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's go to some questions from the audience. We have a question here in regards to validation and obtaining some of those final data sets for studies. Do you have any experience or guidance on how you're handling those tools in regards to, first of all, whose responsibility is it? That's engineering versus operations, and how you're incorporating that into data management plans. So maybe Ian and Michael would like to have a little go at this, if you've seen the question. Ian, what are your thoughts on that about data sets?
So I think, like anything with technology implementations, validation and responsibility actually is across multiple groups. You've got IT QA that's going to give you the framework and the approach and the systems to actually validate. You've got engineering that actually supports the infrastructure and access to the data at the end of the day. And operations has a role in terms of saying what data is actually essential for actually completing the validation. So you need to actually help design the use cases in terms of what are you trying to achieve and what does good like, and what's the happy path versus what is the negative path. So it's not just one organization or one function that's really responsible, but it's a multifactorial situation.
And Mikhail,
do you want to?
Sure, no, happy to add.
Yeah.
I definitely echo what Ian said, and I'm honestly very pleased and happy to see that somebody asked a question about data management plans. One of my favorite topics, and we're talking about all the truly fancy stuff in terms of AI, ML, and so on. But let's not forget one thing, that definitely from a regulatory perspective, whatever we do, we have to document. And the DMP is the central point of reference when it comes to clinical studies where all of our data management activities should be documented. So when it comes to studies where you are planning to use certain tools, certain concepts around AI, there are places in the DMP, and if you don't have it, to adding chapters in terms of how do you plan proactively and document proactively, how do you plan to collect this data, how do you plan to eventually analyze the data, what is your risk-based approach, and to eventually also think about another area of artificial intelligence. How did you use your standards? How did you embed those ones? All of those areas and items can and should be documented in the DMP like anything else we do from a data management perspective on a clinical study. You can then, of course, branch out and point to other documents, support documents, be it specifications, validation documents, to Ian's point, on how you did that. But definitely not recommended to omit any of those areas here just because it doesn't feel or didn't fit to the traditional way of doing data management.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here from Namita Limay. In how many years do you see us moving towards the use of unsupervised AI? Is that one back for you, Ian? We're bringing you in all the time. Unsupervised
That's
AI.
right. You know, honestly, I probably would have answered this different before 2020. You know, it's all the discussion we've had in terms of the speed in which we pivoted. I think we're going to see the acceleration of both supervised AI. And I think that will actually get us into an engagement and discussion, quite honestly, with the regulators, because that's where it needs to start. And I think we'll likely focus on what are the use cases that are appropriate for unsupervised AI, and what are the use cases that are not appropriate or, you know, actually restricted against actually using it. So I would honestly say, instead of, you know, like Mikhail said, you know, 10 years for the adoption of EDC, I think we'll probably be having this discussion quite frequently, and we'll start to see it hopefully being adopted in pilot in the next 2 or 3 years.
So give me some examples then of the most likely that it would be acceptable to be there to have unsupervised AI, and where do you see the possible sticking points?
Yeah, so I think to answer that question, first I need to kind of address what it means by unsupervised a little bit, right? So unsupervised is where AI is literally taking the action without any human interaction whatsoever or validation. So it is literally processing it based upon whatever it thinks is the best answer. And again, this is not a Boolean statement, an if-then statement where there's only an A or a B answer. This could be a multifactorial answer. And I think what we'll probably see is areas that do not directly impact the primary objective, patient safety, or even potentially related to investigative product. If it's more of the transactional aspects, you know, how you actually move data, for example, or what you actually need to do in certain scenarios that doesn't actually impact the overall quality or the intent of the clinical trial, those would probably be the first use cases in which you could see unsupervised UI coming to bear. I would struggle to see immediately, you know, where it has direct impact on quality, patient safety, or the primary objective. Things like that, I think it'll always fall back to supervised AI.
Another question from Dawn Kaminsky. If a company is new to AI and ML, how do they even start thinking about implementation and leveraging? What could be an easily manageable and doable first step? And that is, I think, so often this is, I mean, people are just scared to make that first leap, aren't they, and don't know how to do it. I mean, I will come to you, Ian, but I don't know if anyone else has got some thoughts on it first. I mean, where Yes, Kathleen.
Yes. So just based on our own experience, one good first step that people may want to consider is process automation. So again, going back to the concept of value, doing a very robust analysis on where you spend most time. Things that are, quite frankly, don't require too much skills, such as processing files, moving data sets, and just automating that with implementing bots. Another area where we've been very successful in the implementation of bots is series adverse event reconciliation. So it's not that the bot reconciles and issues the queries about potential discrepancies on their own, it's that the bot highlights for the data manager where the differences are, so that the data manager doesn't have to spend time, kind of plowing through reams of listings. So these are examples initially. Then second step, at least in our organization, was what I described earlier, to start attacking discrepancy management, query generation. And this is in the supervised AI realm, right? There's still a human in the loop. You're still verifying that what the machine has identified for you as a potential discrepancy is indeed a true discrepancy that needs to be queried. And you need to also verify that the way the machine has worded the query on your behalf as a suggestion is appropriate. And this is greatly aided by confidence rating on the part of the tool that presents you this discrepancy for your evaluation. One could envision, I don't think we're there yet, but one could envision that once you start reaching a very high confidence level, as determined by the machine, maybe those queries can go. If you find that, close to 100% of the time you agree with the machine, then maybe it becomes appropriate to let those queries go without human intervention. So these are just suggestions as to how people can start getting their feet wet with machine learning and artificial intelligence implementation.
Thank you very much indeed. Oh, sorry, Mikhail, yes, please.
And Mikhail wanted to
maybe
add something.
Quick addition for a complete, maybe different area that Catherine, which definitely valid for the early steps towards AI and machine learning could be the whole world of data standards. We heard some references today towards data standards, how it can drive quality and speed as well. You can envision, and I've seen examples already, if you have, for example, machine readable protocols, and to unleash the power of artificial intelligence to suggest your CDISC standards, be it C-, SDTM, and ADAM, to use on those protocols, it can give you definitely an advantage in speed and quality. Just one practical example here, I think that many companies now have a solid and robust approach to data standards. But as many of us know, you start with that set, and then if you look at the final product, you see how many deviations you had to those standards at your final product, be it on the SDTM, ADAM, or C- level. Imagine artificial intelligence with time and data learning to say, when you start with this set of data standards, we know now that you always end up with all of those changes. So it would save us so much time and reduce the number of changes to be done if you know what, let's not change. We know where you're going to end up at the beginning. So let's start with the end in mind and using AI to say, look, we know where this is going. This is your set of standards, and it will reduce the amount of changes in programming, edit checks, how to collect data, and so on. So to that question, which I think came from Dawn, is I think that the world of data standards would be one area where unleashing the power of AI might be a good first step as well.
Thank you. What are your thoughts? This is a question come in. What are your thoughts about the adoption of the use of synthetic control arms in clinical trials? Mikhail, maybe you've got something to say on that, and I don't know whether anyone, Jonathan, has got something to say.
I'm happy to make a quick start here, and I'm sure that some of my colleagues might want to jump into that. So synthetic arms, basically data that is out there that you can tap in, data that the literature has accepted as valid. It goes back to speed. It goes back to saving money, as well as why would you run additional arms in a clinical study, prolonging the time of a study, exposing more patients to a drug or a standard of care or placebo where we already know the answer to. I don't want to go as so far as maybe calling it unethical. There might be sometimes certain scientific reasons why you want to redo a clinical study or confirm results. But having said that, there is so much data out there right now, so we can rather focus on the innovative, the new part, the unknown part of a clinical study, than wasting whatever sort of resources on things that are already known. And again, the data is there. It's the one part that should be relatively easy to tap into, rather than recollecting it and revalidating it, going through the full machinery. So if it's out there, tap into it.
What do you think, Jonathan?
No, I mean, I agree. I think if it's out there and companies are willing to make that available in order to determine those synthetic arms in conjunction with, the other arms within the study, I agree that I think whatever we can do to help expedite as well as limit the amount of unneeded exposure, I think, is absolutely important.
There is another question for you, Jonathan, here. Do you think that traditional methods for running trials will remain for certain therapeutic areas or types?
Yeah, and that's a great question and a great point. I mean, I think certain therapeutic areas, at least for now, whether it be an oncology study or a certain cardiovascular study, which most likely will require a patient to be in the hospital in an area of treatment that would be difficult to do in a more decentralized. And what I've seen with studies like that is it kind of becomes a combination and maybe what you'd consider to be a hybrid type study, where certain visits are done in the hospital or in a academic research center or wherever, where there are certain MRIs, CAT scans, some types of, other types of ambulatory things that need to be done that would be very difficult to do in a remote, decentralized way, that would most likely require a hybrid approach. So patients are in for a certain period of time. Maybe there are other types of assessments and things that are done at varying time points along the time and event schedule of a particular study. So I think to answer the question, yeah, I think there are some that will be more what I would characterize as hybrid, where and when possible. And if not, it might end up being that it's more of a traditional in or on-site type clinical trial.
Okay. I mean, we've got another one here. What is the threshold, generally speaking, in terms of volume of data at which an AI ML solution would bring value? Is this something we're seeing bring value in larger trials or later phases? This is from Alexandra Mousouris. So what's the threshold in terms of volume of data at which an AI ML solution would bring value? As soon as I hear AI, I assume I'm going to you, but do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think you have to look at value in a couple different ways, right? So there's value in terms of cycle time, there's value in terms of productivity, and there's value in terms of quality. And there's no real threshold, I would say, per se, in terms of a single trial and a limit there, right? You could be talking about a primary endpoint, which may have only a handful of data points across the entire given trial. But when you start thinking about it from the lens of quality, then it becomes really important. Now, the second part of that answer is there has to be sufficient data volume in order to design the machine learning model or the AI capability. So that's outside, that's actually more in the implementation. So within a trial, I don't think there's a threshold. In the implementation, absolutely there's a threshold, and it really depends upon the use case, unfortunately.
Okay. We've got a question for Jonathan. Do you see the development of decentralized organizations that are able to collect clinical samples and to be able to provide those samples to a centralized review of results, So it's a decentralized organization to collect clinical samples and then provide those samples to a centralized review of results, such as Susan Krikorian. Jonathan.
I would help if I unmuted. I see that increasing, right? That has been something that's been a challenge as far as collecting, laboratory samples and other kinds of things with patients from their own home. And I see companies rising up to that occasion now and being able to collect that with whether it's traveling nurses or traveling coordinators going, doing the blood draws, doing the clinical sample collection, and having those processed appropriately. So, I also see varying IRT vendors and others coming along where they're actually looking at being able to provide drug product and the actual clinical trial materials being shipped directly to the patient's homes. There's still a lot of work to be done in that area to ensure compliance, to ensure that it's not being delivered to the wrong home. All of those things that are absolutely critical in ensuring a quality clinical trial. But yes, I mean it's increasing in its frequency and how companies are rising to that occasion.
So you drop in a concern there. This leads to another question for you. So have you seen any concerns from sites in the shifts towards decentralized trials? Because I mean, you're saying that there's a huge industry interest and even the regulators coming on board, but are there concerns?
I would think that the concerns, and certainly my other colleagues on here can chime in on this topic too, but what I think I hear the most about is just the preponderance of the number of technologies, whether it's a sensor or a connected device or something that sites have to manage and get that given to the patient in order for them to connect, and who to contact when there's an issue. So it goes back to one of the comments I made during kind of our earlier conversation about making sure that you're providing adequate technical supports to the sites, how they gain access to these systems and how they ensure that these things are being done. They're being bombarded, I think, with a lot of different solutions and technologies at these sites. I mean, it's been a complaint that's been a long-standing complaint, even harkening back to my early days, back in the mid 90s, starting in this industry when we started, using fax-based data collection systems, which were so cutting edge back then. For how we collected data, and sites, having more and more responsibilities on them. And I think we just have to be conscious about the number of technologies, the number of solutions, both that they have to manage, as well as make sure that their patients get that and how the patients get supported in the use of those tools. And I think that is what I would characterize as kind of what a lot of the site concerns are about. But again, others on the panel.
I mean, there's a question that leads right into that, which says, do you see sites making a much higher investment in technology nowadays? I mean, you mentioned that they're having to use lots more.
Well, they are having to use lots and lots more, but they're being provided with those technologies, right? It's not so much that the sites are investing in those technologies, but I think that they're having to deal with all these different tools and devices in order to collect these kinds of data, as well as then I think the other important part not to be overlooked is their interactions with the patients connected to their site in order to support them to get the data needed for a given clinical trial. I think that's the conundrum.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on these questions that we've just looked at, the concerns of sites about decentralized trials? Otherwise, we'll move on. We have other questions. But
yeah, just one small point, Kathy. What we are seeing in terms of sites, I wouldn't say adoption of technology, but thinking about the technology ecosystem, is that they are increasingly interested in not having to re-enter the data twice. So if the data is already in their EHR system, they are quite keen on just passing it on to us without having to pay staff to re-enter it into our EDC system. So this is something that, and certainly we're very interested in doing that, leveraging the EHR data. But we are seeing a greater, openness to this.
Right.
Let's take this as a last question, because I then have a general question I want to ask you all. But so this is, will unsupervised AI technology be used in DM operations like data reconciliation? So Catherine and then Michael, unsupervised AI technology.
Yeah, so a lot of what we do in data management has to do with data reconciliation, making sure that the data that we have collected are consistent across the various files, the various data sets, the various CRFs, the various forms. And, you know, yes, of course. So first step is, can you use AI to reconcile data? The answer is yes, that's clear. Again, provided that you have sufficiently significant bolus of data to train the system, then, you know, there's no barrier. Unsupervised, in my mind, it depends on the level of confidence that you can achieve. Again, going back to my earlier point, if you achieve really high levels of confidence that consistently you as a data manager agree with what with the suggestion that the tool is providing, and yes.
Okay, let me bring Michael.
Just very quickly, because I know that we might be running out of time here, is I would suggest to go step by step. I mean, we're still in a world where many companies review data dumped listings. So I would be quite happy to go with the supervised AI approach for now, rather than going with the unsupervised one. Think about it, the amount of validation to make sure that people trust that data that you would have to put into the unsupervised approach here. I'd rather have clinical data scientist be the supervisor, heavily aided by the artificial intelligence part. So I wouldn't mind that we take this step by step, as we still have some continuums ahead of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
We must.
Now, just before we say goodbye to everybody, I think that you know, this sort of sense of speed has come out very much in the conversation, and I just wonder whether you could all, in just 30 seconds, just give me a sense of the good and the looking to the future, whether it's a good thing, this new speed that's surrounding this industry, and what you hope can be done with it. You know, where you think that it's going to take the industry, or where there is any caveat where we've got to be careful and not be swept away by the sense of everything developing at a new pace. What would you think, Jonathan? 30 seconds.
I'll give you less than that. I actually don't. I think it's more about being smarter in the way that we execute clinical trials. I don't know that I'd say speed, because I think it's just using the technologies we have to harness, you know, automation and tools like that, and then allowing to focus on the really, really important things in running a clinical trial. That's what I'm very
so it's smart and it's quality, as not just speed. What would you say, Ian?
I would say I should get off mute. At least I got it right this time. I think that there is an element of speed that is important, and I think it's less about speed, more around cycle time. I think we've seen several examples in the marketplace where, I mean, COVID's a great example, getting that product to the market as soon as possible. And you think about it as we get into more hyper-competitive areas like oncology, when you're second to market, it's not just loss of, you know, potential revenue. I mean, in the order of millions, you could be talking about billions. You know, Keytruda versus Opdivo is a great example. So I do think cycle time matters for both competitiveness as well as bringing those products to market. And I think that's going to be largely driven by cycle time. If you think about where we've gone from an industry, it was productivity, then cost, now it's cycle time. That's the new currency. Okay,
thank you. Catherine, 30 seconds, no more.
Yes, so two things. I'm very excited about the speed that we're able to achieve, because that's simply going to mean faster drugs to the patients. However, being speedy entails, as we've seen, implementing a lot of new things, new processes, new technologies, and in doing so, we have to take great care in not leaving anyone behind. And ensure that the adoption is cross-functional, and also very importantly that the regulators are buying in, are understanding and supportive.
Thank you. Michael, just last 15 seconds from you.
very quickly, bringing life-saving drugs to market in a few years rather than 10+ years right now will save lives. We have to be careful that it doesn't backfire. So we can't compromise on quality. So yes, accelerate, but have quality in mind.
Thank you very much indeed. Great note to finish on. And thank you all very much indeed. Thank you for your questions, but thank you very much for dealing with the questions to all of our speakers. So, so today we've been looking at the game changers in 2020, which have shaped the CDM industry. And as we start 2021, you might be wondering what this year has in store for us. Well, SCDM's chair for 2021, Sanjay Bhardwaj, will be addressing just that in our next webinar, which is being held in 2 weeks from now. So it's called So Much for the Game Changers, What's Next for CDM? And it promises to be an insight-packed session. So look out for more information on that, which SCDM will be sending to you shortly. So make sure you join us for that. That's Wednesday, the 3rd of February. But for now, from all of our speakers, a great thank you to everyone who's been watching, to all of you out there, wherever you are in the world. I know that we had several hundred people registered. Don't know how many people were out there watching, but we will do a count. And thank you again to our speakers. And for now, goodbye.